In Section 1, we have the timeline dating from 1959, when Anishinaabe Park was sold to the city of Kenora by the Department of Indian Affairs in Ontario, to 2014 with the 40th year anniversary of the peaceful occupation of Anishinaabe Park. While it was not a 100% peaceful occupation due to the fact that both the Ojibwe and the police were armed, nobody was harmed in the actual occupation of the park. Therefore, it is and technically has a peaceful ending. The actual occupation of the park itself was sparked when Reed Papers dumped mercury into the waters near the Ojibwe community in 1970, about 70 kilometers away. This led to mostly the youth of the Ojibwe Nation wanting to make their displeasure and grievances against the Canadian government known. While it was an armed protest, weapons were in self-defense and there was no actual harm caused to or by the Ojibwe Nation as they occupied the park. The stakes were high, though, as the government was not afraid to use force on the Indigenous peoples if they felt it was necessary, and the Indigenous peoples were constantly treated with disrespect and no regard for their lives or land. This meant, though, that Indigenous peoples were standing up to white authority in a peaceful manner that where they could not be named as the aggressor, and they're standing up for the harmed. So the homeless, displaced, residential school survivors, those that were malnourished due to the government and harmed by everybody that could have harmed them in the Canadian government, the Indigenous peoples were finally standing up against them in some way. Issues from the perspective of the Canadian government, Canada deemed them as a threat to the peace of the general public. The Canadian government wanted to shush the occupation as it wasn't taught in grade school and it isn't referred to in important historical documents. The 40th anniversary of the occupation in 2014 was actually unknown by most. Additionally, the government was prepared to use violence and outright brute force at every opportunity if given even the slightest chance. This was demonstrated at the later gathering at Parliament Hill in 1974, and the government also did not want to acknowledge that this was a problem as they disregarded demands, calls to actions, and etc. Additionally, the New York Times referred to the Ojibwe Nation as militants, also calling them the embattled Ojibwe Nation, completely missing why they were doing what they were doing, and referred to them as young Indians instead of Aboriginal people or Indigenous people. The outcome of the Anishinaabe Park occupation was shown later in the year at the gathering at Parliament Hill on September 30th, 1974. The goal was to show oppression and death the Canadian government committed on Indigenous peoples, and while 800 to 900 Indigenous people showed up, it was a peaceful protest, as while they did push through one line of a barricade, no known police or authority figures were hurt. The RCMP and police, on the other hand, used a handful of different methods to scare and dismantle the situation, as they used more brute force and aggression back against the Indigenous peoples than the Indigenous peoples ever used on them. The issue was not solved, as Indigenous peoples are still treated horribly across Canada to this day, and the land back struggle continues.